I had no idea my life would unravel at that high school reunion. Jillian and I had been married for over a decade, and I was the kind of guy who genuinely thought we had a solid relationship. We weren't perfect, but who is? We shared laughs, built a life together, made plans for the future. I mean, I'd never have guessed she'd risk all that over some guy from her teenage years. But that's what happened. When Jillian's high school reunion rolled around, she seemed more excited than usual. I figured it was because she hadn't seen most of these people in years. She pulled out this old yearbook, laughing over it, even reminiscing about her high school crush, Troy. She talked about him like he was just another high school memory, and I didn't think anything of it. Honestly, I thought it was sweet, nostalgic even. Little did I know, I'd regret that day for a long time. We got to the reunion, and it started off great. We mingled with her old friends, and she introduced me to people I'd only heard about through her stories. Then I noticed Troy. Tall with this slick charm I couldn't quite place, exactly how she described him back in the day. As soon as she spotted him, something changed. Her face lit up, and she practically floated over to him, dragging me along. They fell right into conversation, laughing and catching up like they hadn't missed a day. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe it was just the thrill of seeing someone she hadn't seen in forever. But soon, I felt like a third wheel. She barely acknowledged me. I found myself standing there, sipping my drink, waiting for them to include me or at least make some space for me in the conversation. They didn't. It stung, but I kept quiet. This was her night, her moment to reconnect with people from her past. But then, as the night wore on, it got worse. She drifted off with Troy, the two of them sitting alone, laughing over shared memories, while I was left at the bar with no clue what to do. A few hours in, when I finally approached her and asked if she wanted to leave, she barely looked at me. "You're free to go if you're tired, Greg. I'll catch a ride home." That line should have been my wake-up call. Something was wrong, but instead, I left. Leaving Jillian at that reunion felt wrong. But I convinced myself she just needed her space to catch up with old friends. Maybe I was being too possessive, I thought. I went home, but I didn't sleep a wink. All I could see was her face when she looked at him, the way her eyes sparkled with a familiarity I hadn't seen in a long time. The next morning, I waited, expecting to hear the garage door open any minute. But the hours passed, and Jillian was nowhere to be found. Around noon, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, thinking it'd be her, but instead, it was a text from a friend who'd also been at the reunion. "Hey man, is everything okay? Jillian left with Troy last night. We all thought you were together, but you left alone." That hit like a ton of bricks. I didn't want to believe it. My first thought was maybe they all just shared a cab or something. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that she'd be home any minute. Finally, in the early afternoon, she walked in. She looked disheveled, her hair a little too messy, her makeup smudged. I felt my heart pounding, but I stayed calm. I didn't want to accuse her of anything without knowing the truth. "So late night?" I said, trying to keep my tone even. She sighed, barely meeting my eyes. "Yeah, I ended up at Troy's place. We were just talking, catching up." I nodded slowly. "And you couldn't answer your phone?" She shrugged. "My phone died. And anyway, we were just talking. Nothing happened, Greg." But her words didn't feel right, didn't match her body language. Something was off. I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly, her expression shifted. She gave me this smirk, almost as if she was daring me to dig deeper. And that's when it happened, the confession that shattered everything. With a half smile, she said, "You're going to hear about it eventually, so I'll just say it. I slept with him. We're in love, Greg. We're meant to be." Her words didn't sink in right away. I just stood there stunned, trying to process the fact that my wife was looking me in the eye, telling me she was meant to be with another man. Not just any guy, but her high school boyfriend, the one she hadn't seen in years until last night. It felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal I couldn't even wrap my head around. "What the hell are you talking about, Jillian?" I managed to say, my voice shaking. "We're married. We have a life together. How could you just throw it all away over some guy you haven't seen in, what, 20 years? She shrugged, barely fazed by my reaction. "I don't expect you to understand, Greg. It just happened. Being with him, it felt like everything fell into place. It made me realize that maybe I've been living a lie." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "A lie? What about the 10 years we'd spent together? The home we'd built? The life we'd shared? So, what, you're just done with me? Just like that? I asked, my voice breaking. She crossed her arms and looked at me with this cold, detached expression I'd never seen before. I think it's for the best, Greg. You and I, we were comfortable, sure, but it was never like this. Troy and I, we're connected in a way you wouldn't understand. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Do you even hear yourself, Jillian? This isn't some romantic movie. You don't just leave your husband for a guy from high school. What about everything we've built? What about me? She rolled her eyes, as if I was the one being unreasonable. Maybe you'll understand someday. But Troy and I, there's something real between us. I can't ignore that anymore. Something inside me snapped. I'd always been patient, understanding, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. If you walk out that door, Jillian, that's it. We're done. I won't be here waiting for you when you realize this fantasy doesn't work out. She didn't flinch. Fine, she said simply. I'm leaving. And with that she walked out, leaving me standing in our living room, feeling like the ground had just crumbled beneath me. The silence in that house after she left was suffocating. I could still smell her perfume lingering in the air, like a ghost of the life we had built together. I couldn't even bring myself to sit on the couch, our couch. Everything felt tainted, like a reminder of how blindsided I was. I didn't know what to do, who to call, or even where to start. I felt like a fool. She was my wife, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. And now, in a matter of hours, that life was gone. Torn apart by some guy from her past who swooped in and convinced her she'd been missing out all these years. The anger, the pain, it was all consuming. The next morning, I woke up on the floor in the living room, having barely slept. My phone was full of messages from family and friends, people who'd been at the reunion or had heard the rumors. Apparently, Jillian hadn't been discreet about her newfound love for Troy. Word had spread fast. I was the guy left behind, the one everyone pitied. The pity. That was almost worse than the betrayal. Colleen, my assistant at work, was one of the first to reach out. She'd always been there for me, a solid support in my life, and I could see the sympathy in her messages. She didn't ask what happened, she just let me know she was there if I needed anything. I didn't want to tell her, or anyone, really. But I had to pull myself together enough to get to the office. I couldn't fall apart, not with everyone watching. So I threw on a clean shirt, drove to work, and tried to pretend like my world wasn't shattering. As soon as I walked in, Colleen took one look at me and knew. She didn't pry, just nodded toward my office. Once I was alone, the door barely closed behind me, I felt my shoulders sink. The exhaustion, the pain, it was all pressing down like a weight I couldn't shake. But even in that moment, I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let Jillian have it all. She might think she'd found her soulmate, but I wasn't about to make this easy for her. The first thing I did after settling in at work was call a lawyer. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to ask, just that I needed to protect myself. My entire life felt like it was crumbling, but I wasn't about to let her walk away with everything we'd built together. She made her choice. She could live with the consequences. The lawyer listened as I explained the situation, then gave me a rundown of what we'd need to start a divorce. I felt numb, just sitting there listening to this stranger talk about dividing assets, custody arrangements, if we had kids, which thankfully we didn't, and financial protections. By the end of it, I barely knew what to say. I was living a life I didn't recognize, making plans I never thought I'd have to make. Back at the house, I got to work. I changed the locks that afternoon. I couldn't stand the thought of her just waltzing back in like nothing happened. This was my space now, not hers. I started combing through our finances too. I took her name off the joint accounts and set up a separate one in my name only. She'd left to be with her true love. She could figure out her finances on her own. That night, I sat in our my kitchen, staring at my phone, wondering if she'd call. Part of me wanted her to, wanted to hear her voice and demand she explain how she could throw everything away. But she didn't. No apology, no remorse, just silence. I was furious, and it ate at me. In the days that followed, word spread fast. Friends and family were calling, trying to check in on me, offering condolences. My parents were furious, my mom especially. She'd always been fond of Jillian, thought of her as the daughter she'd never had. Now, She wouldn't even say her name. But surprisingly, it was Colleen and her niece Rebecca, who became my closest allies. Colleen checked on me daily, keeping things light when she could, but serious when I needed it. She knew I didn't want pity, just people around who understood without making a big deal about it. And then there was Rebecca. Rebecca started visiting the office, bringing coffee for her aunt and me, making small talk that felt like a lifeline when I was struggling. She had this way of smiling, a warmth that made me feel less like the poor guy whose wife left him, and more like, just Greg. About a week after she walked out, Jillian showed up at the house. I was in the middle of boxing up some of her things, just trying to clear the space and move forward, and suddenly, there she was, standing in the doorway like nothing had happened. "Greg, we need to talk," she said, her tone far too casual for what she'd put me through. It was like she thought she could just come back, smooth things over, and everything would be fine. I set the box down, refusing to let her see how rattled I was. "What is there to talk about, Jillian? You made your choice, remember?" She looked around, taking in the half-empty closet, the mess of boxes I'd already packed up. Her face fell a bit, and for a second, I saw a flicker of regret. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced with that same stubborn look she'd given me at the reunion. "I thought, maybe we could work something out," she started, her voice softer now. "I don't want things to get ugly, Greg. I know I hurt you, but Troy and I—" "Don't," I cut her off, barely holding back my anger. "Don't you dare say his name in my house." She flinched, but it didn't stop her. "Look, I just think we can be adults about this. We had good years together, Greg, and I don't want to throw that away." "You threw it away the second you walked out that door," I shot back. "You left me for another man, Jillian. You don't get to come back here and act like we're some civil, broken-up couple splitting a dinner bill." She crossed her arms, her jaw set. "Fine. Then what do you want, Greg? You want me to beg?" "I don't want anything from you anymore, Jillian. I just want you to leave. I've started the divorce process." "You wanted to be with him so badly? Go. I'm done." That was when the shock finally hit her. For the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to cut her off so easily, to actually mean it when I said I was done. "Greg, please just give me a chance to explain." But I didn't want explanations, and I sure as hell didn't want her lies. I walked to the door and held it open, waiting. "Get out, Jillian." My voice was cold, even to my own ears. She hesitated, looking at me with this strange mix of anger and desperation, but in the end, she walked out without another word. I watched her go, feeling a hollow satisfaction. She'd made her choice, and now she could live with it. After Jillian left that day, I felt a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't happiness, not even close, but more like the first step out of a prison I didn't know I was in. The house felt empty without her, but that emptiness felt better than the tension and betrayal she'd brought with her. I had a long way to go, but I was done waiting around for her to make up her mind. Colleen and Rebecca kept checking in on me, giving me something to look forward to each day. Colleen was like my unofficial therapist, slipping into my office with a cup of coffee and some story about her cat or her neighbor, keeping things light. She knew I was hurting but didn't push me to talk about it. And Rebecca, well, she was becoming more than just a friendly face. Rebecca started showing up after work, usually with takeout or a few beers. She'd listen, really listen, in a way that made me feel heard and understood. She'd crack jokes, make me laugh when I didn't think I had it in me. Somehow, she had this way of helping me forget, even if just for a little while. She wasn't trying to fix me, she was just there, solid and reliable. One night, as we sat on the back porch, she looked over at me, a softness in her eyes. "You know, Greg, you're handling this a lot better than most people would. I don't know how you're doing it." I shrugged, staring out into the yard, which still had Jillian's rose bushes, now overgrown and neglected. "Feels like I'm just faking it half the time. But I'm starting to see a future without her, you know? I never thought that was possible, but now." She smiled, leaning closer. "Sometimes, life's better when you don't see what's coming. Gives you room for surprises." There was something in the way she looked at me that made me pause. I hadn't thought about being with anyone else since Jillian left, but here was Rebecca, warm and genuine, looking at me in a way that reminded me what it felt like to be wanted. And in that moment, I started to realize maybe there was a future out there for me, one that didn't involve Jillian at all. That night on the porch with Rebecca lingered in my mind for days. Her smile, the way she listened without judgment, and that easy way she had of making me feel whole again, it was a lifeline I hadn't expected. But as I found myself looking forward to her visits, a part of me wrestled with guilt. I'd been married to Jillian for years. And no matter how wrong she'd done me, it felt strange to be moving on so soon. The next weekend, I decided to take a real step forward. I couldn't live surrounded by her things anymore. Our wedding pictures, the decorations she picked out, the small pieces of her scattered across the house. It was all just a reminder of what I'd lost, or maybe what I'd never really had. I started in the living room. Took down the framed wedding photo above the fireplace, where we were both smiling, looking so blissfully unaware. It felt heavy in my hands, like a relic from a different lifetime. I stared at it, trying to remember what that day felt like, but all I could think of was how much of a stranger she seemed now. I wrapped it in an old towel and put it in the box labeled Jillian. Box by box, I went through the house, clearing out memories, good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. The ring she'd left behind, I put that in there too. Part of me wondered if she even realized she'd forgotten it, or if she just didn't care. As I worked, I thought about all the times she'd made promises, little ones and big ones, about our future together. How she used to say we'd grow old in this house, sitting on the porch together and watching our kids play in the yard. I used to believe in that vision. But now, all I saw were empty words. By the time I was done, the house felt different, bare but cleaner, like I could breathe again. I took the boxes to the garage and left them there, deciding that maybe one day I'd figure out what to do with them. But for now, they'd stay out of sight, out of mind. That evening, Rebecca came over again, carrying a pizza and a couple of sodas. She walked in, took one look around, and gave me this nod of approval. "Wow, it looks different in here," she said, glancing around at the empty walls. "Feels like a fresh start." I shrugged, feeling a weight lift as I joined her in the kitchen. Yeah, I just couldn't keep living in her shadow. Feels like she's haunted enough of my life as it is. Rebecca leaned against the counter, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "Well, I think it's brave. A lot of people would be hanging on to that stuff for years, trying to hold on to something that's already gone." We ate in the kitchen, leaning against the counters, talking and laughing over stupid stories from work and old movies. Rebecca told me about a time she accidentally set fire to a casserole dish and nearly burned her apartment down. I told her about how, in college, I'd taken a cooking class for an easy credit but ended up nearly poisoning myself by mistaking salt for sugar in a pie. We laughed, harder than I'd laughed in months. And for a moment, it felt like all the bitterness, all the resentment I'd been holding on to, melted away. Sitting there with her, it was the first time since Jillian left that I felt truly, genuinely happy. As the night went on, we moved to the couch, where we settled in, our conversation drifting into quieter, more personal territory. Rebecca opened up about her own past, about a relationship that had ended badly, a guy who'd strung her along for years before leaving her without so much as a goodbye. She didn't say it, but I could tell there was a lot of pain there, wounds she'd never quite healed from. And maybe that's why we clicked so well. We were both a little broken, but not hopeless. I saw something in her, a strength, a resilience, that I didn't know I needed until now. When it got late, she shifted, looking down at her hands before glancing up at me. "So, are you going to be okay, Greg?" I nodded, not entirely sure if it was true but believing it a little more every day. "Yeah. It's getting better. I don't know what I'd be doing if it weren't for you and Colleen, though." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "We're just looking out for you. You deserve someone who sees how great you are, Greg. Don't let Jillian take that from you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I felt the walls around my heart start to crack. I didn't know what was happening between us, or where it would go, but right then, it didn't matter. She was here, and that was enough. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Somehow, packing up Jillian's things and spending the evening with Rebecca had lifted something off me, a part of me that had been clinging to the past. It felt good to focus on what was in front of me instead of the wreckage Jillian had left behind. But life doesn't let you move on that easily. Just as I was starting to find a new rhythm, Jillian called. Seeing her name on my phone screen sent a jolt through me. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity, or maybe a small masochistic part of me, got the better of me, and I answered. "Greg," she said, her voice hesitant. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." The audacity hit me hard. How I'm doing? After she had ripped my life apart and left me to deal with the pieces? I took a breath, keeping my tone as steady as I could. I'm fine, Jillian. Been busy sorting things out, moving on, you know, all the usual after someone walks out. She sighed, that familiar dramatic sigh she'd use whenever she wanted sympathy. I know I hurt you, Greg. But things with Troy, they're complicated. Complicated. The word felt like a slap. You mean the man you left me for? The one who was apparently your soulmate? I bit out. What's complicated about that? For a moment, there was silence. Then she spoke, quieter, almost embarrassed. It's not working out the way I thought it would. Troy's, well, he's different than I remembered. Of course. The fantasy didn't match reality. That was probably the first thing that made sense since she'd left. I almost laughed but held it back. Jillian, I don't know what you expected. You threw away our marriage for a fling, and now what? You're regretting it. There was a pause. Maybe I am, she whispered. I thought I'd feel whole again, like he was the missing piece, but it's not like that. It's all falling apart. Hearing her say that should have given me satisfaction. But it didn't. If anything, it just felt sad, tragic even. I wasn't about to give her a shoulder to cry on, though. Well, Jillian, I said, keeping my tone cold, I hope you find whatever you're looking for. But don't expect me to be here, waiting around. I've got my own life to rebuild. I hung up before she could say another word, my chest heaving with a mix of anger, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. Part of me ached to hear that she was regretting her choices, but another part, the part that had spent the last few weeks moving on, felt stronger. Later that day, I told Rebecca about the call. We were having coffee in the break room at work, and when I mentioned Jillian's regrets, her eyes widened. She actually had the nerve to tell you that? Rebecca shook her head, clearly disgusted on my behalf. That woman has no shame. I chuckled, feeling a flicker of pride at her fierce loyalty. Yeah, well, it's not my problem anymore. She made her bed, now she can lie in it. Rebecca's face softened. I know it still stings, though. It's not easy to let go of someone you loved. Hearing that struck a chord. No, it's not, I admitted, looking down at my coffee. But I think I'm finally ready to. I want to focus on what's real, on people who actually care about me. She looked at me, her eyes holding something I hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine warmth, genuine care. You deserve that, Greg. You deserve someone who sees the real you and sticks around for the right reasons. For the rest of the day, those words stuck with me. Rebecca was right. I did deserve better. I'd spent years putting Jillian first, trying to be the perfect husband, only for her to chase a fantasy with Troy. Now, for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had a shot at happiness again. The days turned into weeks, and Jillian faded further into my past. I spent more time with Rebecca, and every time we were together, I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself. She'd join me for walks, sometimes inviting her Aunt Colleen, and we'd laugh and joke like old friends, building memories that weren't haunted by the past. One evening, as we sat in the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rebecca turned to me, her face bathed in the last light of day. Greg, you know, you're a lot stronger than you think. I'm proud of how far you've come. Her words caught me off guard, but they filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't have done it alone, Rebecca. You've been here every step of the way. I don't know how to thank you. She smiled, reaching out to take my hand. Maybe you don't have to. Maybe I'm just happy to be here with you. As our fingers intertwined, a quiet understanding settled between us. Jillian's betrayal had shattered me, but in that moment, I knew I was finally free. Rebecca was my fresh start, my chance at real happiness, and for the first time, I was ready to embrace it fully. Rebecca and I spent more time together, and with each passing day, the wounds Jillian had left in me seemed to fade, replaced by something genuine and steady. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a fairy tale. Honestly, I was done with those kinds of fantasies. Rebecca was real. She didn't try to fix me or fill my silences with pity. She just stayed, solid and unwavering. One Friday evening, she invited me over to her place for dinner. It felt like a big step, meeting her on her home turf, seeing a part of her life outside of our usual coffee runs and park visits. She lived in a cozy little apartment on the edge of town, decorated with plants and books piled high in every corner. It was a warm space, very her. Make yourself comfortable, she called out from the kitchen, setting down a steaming plate of pasta on the small table in the center of the room. I sat, looking around at the photos on the wall, some with her family, one with Colleen, and a few from her travels. I saw pictures of mountains and beaches, places she'd visited and stories I'd heard her tell. Sitting there, it hit me just how much of a life she'd lived, how much she'd been through, and yet, here she was, willing to be with a guy like me who was still piecing himself back together. As we ate, the conversation flowed, light at first, then dipping into deeper territory. "So do you think you'll ever look back on Jillian and feel anything other than, the betrayal?" she asked carefully, her eyes never leaving mine. I thought about it, stirring my fork through the pasta. I don't know. Part of me wants to let it go, to forgive her for myself, not for her. But then, another part just can't. Not yet, anyway. Rebecca nodded, her gaze understanding. It's okay if you don't. Sometimes, things don't get wrapped up neatly. They just exist. You don't have to make peace with everything. That was something I hadn't heard before. I'd always thought I had to forgive to move on, that I had to be at peace with Jillian's betrayal to be happy again. But maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe some things don't deserve peace. Maybe they just stay as scars you carry with you. After dinner, we settled on the couch, talking quietly as the evening grew darker. I could feel the shift between us, that subtle pull that had been building for weeks, and for once, I didn't feel the urge to pull away. I leaned a little closer, our shoulders brushing, and she didn't move back. When she turned to look at me, her face just inches from mine, I could see something warm and vulnerable in her eyes. "Greg," she murmured, almost a whisper, "I'm glad you're here." I didn't say anything, just reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The room was so quiet I could hear her breathing, feel the tension building between us. Finally, I closed the distance, pressing my lips to hers in a kiss that felt like both an ending and a beginning, a way of closing the door on the past while opening myself up to something new. She kissed me back, soft and unhurried, and I realized in that moment that I didn't need grand gestures or over-the-top romance. This was enough. Rebecca was enough. When we finally pulled back, she smiled, resting her forehead against mine. "Guess I should thank Jillian," she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. I chuckled, holding her close. "Not sure I'm there yet, but, yeah, maybe someday." In the months that followed, Rebecca and I settled into a rhythm. She didn't push me to rush into anything, and I didn't pretend to be fully healed. I was honest with her about the tough days, the moments when something would remind me of my old life, of Jillian, and the ache would return. But Rebecca never flinched. She'd hold my hand, or sit with me in silence, or crack a joke to pull me out of it. One weekend, she invited me on a trip out of town. It was a place she'd visited years ago, a small cabin by a lake, quiet and tucked away from the world. She said it was her place to recharge, to escape whenever life got too heavy. She wanted to share it with me, to give me a chance to leave everything behind, even if just for a weekend. We spent the days hiking, cooking meals over a campfire, talking about everything and nothing. At night, we'd sit by the lake, watching the stars, the quiet around us so profound it felt like the whole world had disappeared. Out there, in the stillness of the forest, I felt more like myself than I had in years. And with Rebecca beside me, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I could finally put down the burden of the past. One night by the fire, as I was lost in the flickering flames, Rebecca spoke, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what you want, going forward? What you want from life?" It was a question I hadn't let myself consider since Jillian left. But looking at Rebecca, her face lit by the warm glow of the fire, I felt a surge of hope, of possibility. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I want a life where I don't have to look back, where I can just be happy in the present." She nodded, her hand slipping into mine. "That sounds like a pretty good life, Greg. And I think you're well on your way." And for the first time, I believed it. Out there under the stars with Rebecca, I felt like the last remnants of my old life were finally falling away, leaving room for something new, something real. As we sat together, I realized that I was finally ready for this next chapter, with Rebecca by my side. And this time, I wasn't afraid to let myself feel it. Things with Rebecca felt natural, easy. I was happier than I'd been in years, and life was settling into a rhythm I could finally see myself enjoying. It wasn't forced, it didn't come with any heavy expectations. I started to believe that maybe the worst was behind me. But life, as I'd come to learn, doesn't always let go of you that easily. One afternoon, as I was locking up at work, I noticed a familiar figure standing by my car. Jillian. She looked different, worn, a bit hollow. She spotted me, giving a tentative wave that I almost didn't return. "Greg," she called, voice barely audible over the sounds of the street. I walked over, trying to keep my face neutral. "What do you need, Jillian?" She shifted, glancing down at her hands like she was nervous. I hadn't seen her like this before, uncertain, almost apologetic. But I wasn't about to let myself get drawn back in. I just wanted to talk," she said, looking up with a forced smile. "Could we maybe grab a coffee?" I nearly laughed. Coffee? As if she could sweep up the mess she left behind with a latte and small talk. I shook my head. "I don't think that's a good idea. I've moved on, Jillian. I suggest you do the same." She blinked, her expression dropping. "Please, Greg. I need you to hear me out. 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I agreed, mostly because I wanted to finally close this chapter for good. We sat at a nearby cafe, the tension thick as we sipped our coffee in silence. She looked around, like she was searching for words, but the look in her eyes was pure regret. Finally, she spoke. "I know I don't deserve this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize what I had with you until it was too late." I sat back, crossing my arms. "So things with Troy didn't work out, and now you're having second thoughts. Is that it?" Her face fell, a shadow passing over her eyes. "It's not just that, Greg. I was stupid. I thought what Troy and I had was real, that it was some kind of, I don't know, fate. But he's not who I thought he was. I gave up everything for something that wasn't real. And now I'm alone." I sighed, a mixture of frustration and sadness welling up in me. I'd loved her once, and seeing her so defeated stirred up memories I thought I'd let go of. But I wasn't the same man who would have dropped everything to fix her mistakes. "Jillian, I gave you everything. I put my whole heart into our marriage. You were my world, and you threw that away for a fantasy. I can't just forgive that because you made a mistake." She nodded, wiping a tear. "I don't expect you to. I just wanted you to know that I regret it. Every day." The old me might have taken that as a sign, might have thought there was some unfinished business between us. But now, sitting across from her, I felt nothing but a strange, detached sense of pity. She was the one who'd lost everything, not me. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, finally feeling the closure I'd been looking for. "But it's too late, Jillian. I've moved on, and I'm happy. I hope someday you find some peace too." She swallowed hard, her face crumpling slightly. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't owe her an answer, but I gave her one anyway. "Yeah, there is. And I intend to make her as happy as I tried to make you." Jillian nodded, managing a sad smile. "I'm glad, Greg. You deserve that." As I left the cafe, I felt a weight lift off me. The past had come knocking one last time, but this time, I'd had the strength to walk away from it for good. I got in my car, already reaching for my phone to text Rebecca. I just wanted to hear her voice, to tell her how much she meant to me. When I called, she answered with a cheerful, "Hey, done with work already?" I smiled, the stress from that conversation with Jillian fading at the sound of her voice. "Yeah, just wrapped up. You want to grab dinner tonight?" She hesitated, her voice turning playful. "Actually, I was about to call you. How would you feel about meeting my parents?" That question stopped me in my tracks. Meeting her parents. It felt big, a step I hadn't even thought about until now. But as I sat there, with the last of Jillian's ghost finally behind me, I realized I was ready for this. Ready to let Rebecca fully into my life, no reservations. "I'd love that," I said, meaning it with everything I had. "Tell me where and when." The dinner with Rebecca's parents was surprisingly easy. Her mom was warm, the kind of person who welcomed me with a hug and a genuine smile. Her dad was quiet at first but friendly, cracking a joke about keeping his little girl safe before handing me a beer. I felt at home with them, like I belonged in this picture. Rebecca seemed more relaxed too, her hand finding mine under the table, a steadying presence that reminded me this was where I was meant to be. After dinner, as we said our goodbyes, her mom pulled me aside. "She's been through a lot, you know. But you seem like the kind of man who'll treat her right." I nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility, and knowing I wanted to live up to it. "I promise you, I'll do my best." That night, Rebecca and I drove back to her place, the quiet comfort between us filling the car. She glanced over at me, her face soft with a happiness that warmed me to my core. "So how do you feel?" she asked, squeezing my hand. I looked at her, taking in her smile, her kindness, and the quiet strength that had carried me through some of my darkest days. "I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be." We parked, and before we even made it to her door, I pulled her close, kissing her deeply, letting her know that every word I'd said was true. This was my future, not some hollow fantasy, but something real and solid, something worth fighting for. As the night settled around us, I knew that I'd finally, truly left the past behind. And with Rebecca, I was ready to build a life I wouldn't need to forget. The family picnic was like stepping into a life I hadn't realized I'd missed. Rebecca's family filled the park with their laughter, voices, and warmth. Her mom insisted on introducing me to every relative, making sure I had a full plate at all times, while her dad cracked jokes, patting me on the back like I was already one of his own. Even her cousins gave me a nod of approval, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was truly welcomed. When the family's famous three-legged race was announced, Rebecca's eyes lit up. "We're entering," she said, dragging me to the starting line. She knelt down to tie our legs together, grinning up at me. "You ready?" "I think so," I laughed, feeling a rush of excitement I hadn't felt in ages. The race started, and we lurched forward, laughing as we tried to keep our balance. I nearly tripped twice, and Rebecca practically held me up. When we crossed the finish line first, she threw her arms around me, and her family erupted in cheers. Standing there, surrounded by laughter and clapping, I felt like I belonged to something real, something I'd almost given up on finding. As the sun started to set, we settled down under a big oak tree. The food was spread out before us, everyone passing around plates, her younger cousins darting around to catch fireflies. Her parents sat nearby, holding hands and watching their family, and I felt an unexpected surge of gratitude just to be part of this day. Rebecca leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand slipping into mine. "Thank you for coming," she murmured. "I know family stuff can be a lot, but it just wouldn't have felt right without you here." I looked down at her, feeling a calm I hadn't known in a long time. "Honestly, this is exactly where I want to be." Her Aunt Colleen came over, giving me a warm, knowing smile. "You two look like quite the team," she said, glancing at Rebecca with a twinkle in her eye. "We're glad to have you, Greg. You fit right in." I felt a tightness in my throat, a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you. Really, this all means a lot to me." After Colleen walked off, Rebecca squeezed my hand, her gaze soft. "You don't have to thank us, you know. You're part of this now." As dusk turned to night, the sky filled with stars, and the younger kids fell asleep by the fire. Rebecca and I stayed under the oak tree, the sounds of laughter and fireflies filling the air around us. It felt like more than just a family picnic. It felt like a promise that I wasn't just some guest or outsider anymore. I had finally, truly, found my place. The picnic lingered in my mind for days. Being there with Rebecca and her family had settled something in me. For the first time I felt grounded, not just like I was passing through someone else's world, but as though I belonged there with her, in this new life we were building. One evening, after work, Rebecca invited me over for dinner. She had a certain glow to her, a quiet excitement that made me wonder if something was on her mind. When I arrived, her apartment was filled with the smell of something delicious baking, and she greeted me with a warm hug, her face lighting up in a way that made everything else fade away. "Everything smells incredible," I said, letting her take my coat and guide me to the small dining table she'd set up with candles and flowers. She gave a little shrug, looking pleased. "I just thought it would be nice to do something special." We ate, talking and laughing, trading stories about work and making plans for a weekend hike. After dinner, she poured us each a glass of wine, and we moved to the couch. She curled up beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, and for a while, we sat in comfortable silence, just enjoying the closeness. Then she turned to face me, her expression more serious than I'd expected. "Greg, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, feeling my heart beat a little faster. She hesitated, searching my face. "Have you ever thought about the future? I mean us, moving in together maybe?" The question hung between us, heavy but full of possibility. I felt a rush of emotions, excitement, hope, and a sense of rightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. I hadn't really thought about moving in with anyone since Jillian, but with Rebecca, it was different. There were no lingering doubts or fears of betrayal. Just a genuine feeling that we could create something strong and lasting. I took her hands, looking her in the eye. Rebecca, being with you has brought me back to life in ways I didn't think were possible. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about our future. Moving in feels right. More than right. Her face softened, a mixture of relief and happiness. She leaned in, and we shared a kiss, one that held all the things we'd been building between us over the past few months. When we pulled back, she smiled, a bit shyly. So maybe we could start looking for a place together, she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Yeah, I said, feeling a warmth spread through me. Let's do it. In the weeks that followed, we spent our weekends looking at apartments, laughing over paint colors, and planning out our new space together. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to build a life I didn't have to look back on with regret. And with each step, each plan, Rebecca became less of a chapter in my story and more of my whole book. One Sunday, as we were walking through a potential place, Rebecca stopped in the empty living room, turning to face me. You know, Greg, she said softly, I can't wait to make this our home. I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I'm grateful every day that you're here. I stepped closer, taking her hands. I'm the lucky one, Rebecca. Everything with you, it's more than I ever thought I'd find. We stood there, the future stretching before us, and in that moment, I felt like I'd finally arrived. Together, we were stepping into something new, something real, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to take that step. In the following weeks, Rebecca and I found a cozy apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't huge, but it was filled with light, had a little balcony perfect for morning coffee, and a living room just big enough for all the dreams we were starting to build together. Moving in was chaotic, boxes piled everywhere, our laughter filling the space as we argued over where the couch should go or which plates to keep. It felt good, like we were creating something new from scratch. And with every piece of furniture we arranged and every photo we hung, the apartment started feeling more like ours. One night, as we finally collapsed on the couch, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, Rebecca leaned against me, smiling contentedly. It feels like home already, she murmured, her hand resting lightly on mine. I squeezed her hand, looking around at the space we'd claimed together. That's because it is our home. We sat there in the quiet, both of us letting the reality sink in. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace. No looking back, no more haunting memories, just the steady comfort of knowing I was right where I was meant to be. The weeks after moving in flew by. Life with Rebecca felt like it had fallen into a natural rhythm, a balance I didn't know I needed. We'd spend quiet mornings on the balcony, sipping coffee and planning our day, and in the evenings we'd cook together, filling our new home with laughter and the smell of dinners we were both usually too tired to get right. One night, as we sat down to eat, Rebecca looked at me with a soft, thoughtful smile. You know, she started, pushing her hair back, I don't think I've ever felt this at peace before. It's like we fit. I reached for her hand across the table, nodding. I know exactly what you mean. I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again. Her eyes brightened, and she gave my hand a squeeze. I think this is just the beginning. And it was. Every day felt like a small step forward, away from the hurt and toward something better. Together, we were building a life that felt whole and real, something steady I could trust. Looking at her then, I knew this was more than a fresh start. It was the future I'd always wanted, and I was finally ready to live it, one day at a time.